The fluorescent tubes in the Blackwood Associates basement archives had been flickering for 19 months. 19 months that Isabel Marsh had noted in the maintenance request log. Initialing each entry with the same quiet diligence she brought to everything at an auction house that sold heirlooms her own family had once owned. Nobody read the maintenance log. Nobody read anything Izzy produced. They simply expected the inventory sheets to appear correctly formatted, the condition reports to match buyer expectations, the provenance research to materialize without error, and the girl in the beige cardigan who shuffled boxes in the basement to remain exactly where they put her invisible, forgettable, beneath the notice of people who paid more for a single wristwatch than she made in a year. 8 years. 8 years of working jobs beneath her capabilities, of eating meals from vending machines while cataloging China services worth more than her student debt, of sleeping in apartments she couldn't afford in neighborhoods where Blackwood Associates clients would never set foot, and all of it to get close enough to the woman who had murdered her grandfather and stolen her inheritance to gather the kind of evidence that would burn Cordelia Cunningham's empire to ash and salt the earth where it stood. Izzy hadn't told anyone the truth. Not Meg, the archivist who had become her only friend over 2 years of shared basement lunches and whispered complaints about management. Not Julian Thorne, the senior appraiser whose research citations included 3 papers she had written under a pseudonym during the fellowship she had been forced to abandon. Not a single soul in the entire institution built on the proceeds of her grandfather's murder. She had simply shown up at the Blackwood Associates employment office 3 years ago with a fabricated GED, a wardrobe carefully calibrated to suggest poverty without desperation, and a desperation to work in archives specifically that read exactly as eager and unthreatening as she needed it to read. They hired her because she was invisible, because she asked for nothing, because her references were fabricated but impeccable, because Cordelia Blackwood Cunningham, the woman who had married Reginald Blackwood 18 months before his convenient heart failure, the woman who produced a will leaving herself everything and disinheriting the troubled granddaughter who had abandoned the family in its time of grief, would never think to look for that granddaughter in the basement of her own auction house, cataloging the evidence of her crimes. If you ever had to work alongside people who destroyed your life while pretending you didn't exist, subscribe now. We tell stories about invisible survivors who refuse to stay unseen. The Blackwood estate sale had been announced 6 weeks ago. Every major auction house in the city had competed for consignment, and Blackwood Associates had won through the simple advantage of being the firm Cordelia Cunningham personally controlled. The estate of Reginald Blackwood, shipping magnate, philanthropist, collector of rare timepieces and early American furniture, worth an estimated $400 million at conservative valuation, was to be sold piece by piece over 3 days of exclusive auction events. The proceeds would go to the Cunningham Family Foundation, which everyone understood meant Cordelia's personal accounts, since the foundation employed exactly 0 people and funded exactly 0 charitable initiatives. The cataloging had fallen to Izzy. Of course it had. She had made sure of that, requesting the assignment, citing her particular interest in horological items with the careful neutrality of someone who had absolutely no connection to the Blackwood family whatsoever. Her supervisor had approved it with the vague benevolence of someone assigning unpleasant tasks to staff members who wouldn't complain. And for 3 weeks, Izzy had spent every working hour in the basement archives, handling her grandfather's possessions one by one, documenting each item with the obsessive precision of someone saying goodbye in the only way she was permitted. The pocket watches had been the worst. Lot 47, the personal effects collection of Reginald Blackwood, including timepieces, correspondence, and personal memorabilia. 17 watches, each one she remembered from childhood. The Patek Philippe had worn to her 8th birthday party. The one had let her hold while he explained how the gears worked. The Breguet her grandmother had given him on their 20th anniversary. The one had stopped wearing after the funeral, and which Izzy had last seen on Cordelia's wrist at the reading of the forged will. The custom-modified Swiss lever escapement piece that Izzy had given him for Christmas the year she turned 12. The modification she had designed herself based on his stories about watchmaking. The innovation that had eventually been published in a specialist journal under a pseudonym that Julian Thorne had cited in his own research without ever knowing the original author was currently fetching his coffee. She held that watch in her hands for a long time during the first cataloging session, pressed it to her chest where the leather cord hung, where her grandfather's signet ring threaded on it pressed against her skin through her cardigan. Let herself feel, for exactly 30 seconds, the weight of everything she had lost. Then she set it back in its foam casing, picked up her clipboard, and began writing the most accurate provenance description anyone had ever produced for any auction item anywhere, because she had lived with these objects, loved the person who cherished them. And she would be damned before she let Cordelia sell them to strangers without the world knowing exactly what and whose legacy they represented. Have you ever had to watch strangers buy pieces of your life while pretending it didn't matter? Tell me in the comments the community understands wounds like this. Julian Thorne noticed her during the state preview event. Not notice her. Exactly had been working beside her for 2 years without truly seeing her, but something shifted during the Lot 47 display examination. A wealthy potential buyer, the kind whose portfolio probably exceeded the auction's entire estimate, had asked a technical question about the movement manufacture of the centerpiece watch. Julian hesitated. The information wasn't in the prepared file. He was about to deflect when a voice from across the room answered with the kind of specificity that came only from deep familiarity. Swiss lever escapement. 1892. Modified by the original owner. Izzy stood 3 display cases away. Clipboard clutched to her chest, eyes fixed on a watch like it might disappear as she blinked. Reginald Blackwood had it customized. The modification isn't documented in standard reference materials. Silence. The buyer was impressed. Julian was confused. He turned to stare at her really stare. For maybe the first time in the 2 years she had been bringing him coffee and organizing his files and correcting his authentication errors without ever taking credit. How did you know that? His voice came out strange. That's not in the file. That modification isn't documented anywhere. Izzy met his eyes for exactly 1 second. In that second, something passed between them, a recognition. He couldn't yet interpret and she couldn't afford to explain. Then she looked away. I read a lot. She walked away before he could ask the obvious question. But he watched her go. And for the first time in 2 years, Julian Thorne found himself unable to look away from the girl in the beige cardigan who knew things she absolutely should not know. Team Izzy or Team Julian? The slow burn chemistry that started with a watch. Declare your allegiance now. War begins in the comments. Meg O'Connor found her 3 nights before the auction. The archivist had been with Blackwood Associates for 23 years, had processed the original estate documents after Reginald's death, and had noticed things she couldn't unnotice. Things she had copied. Things she had preserved in a locked file in her personal archive, where corporate audits never reached. I noticed discrepancies. Meg pushed a folder across her cluttered desk, her reading glasses perched on her nose, her voice dropping to the whisper of someone who had carried secrets too long. The will that Cunningham presented wasn't in the original document stream. The notary stamp was from 3 months after Reginald's death date on some pages. And this, she produced a photograph, placed it on the desk between them with the reverence of someone handling sacred texts. The last page of a will, the real one. Izzy's hands shook as she picked it up. Her grandfather's signature, the confident flourish she recognized from birthday cards and homework approvals, and the letterhead written her on her 18th birthday, the one that said, "My darling girl, whatever happens, remember that you are the brightest star in my sky, and no one can extinguish a star." The text above the signature named her Isabel Blackwood, sole heir, executor of the estate in its entirety, dated 2 days before his death, when he was supposedly confused and heavily medicated per Cordelia's claims. There's more. Meg's voice dropped further. The toxicology report. Someone at the medical examiner's office leaked it before it was sealed. It was buried in the routine death classification, but she swallowed arsenic. Slow accumulation. Looks natural. Takes someone with access to his daily medications, knowledge of his supplement regimen, and about 6 months of consistent administration. Izzy set the photograph down. Her face had gone very still. The particular stillness of someone whose worst suspicions had just been confirmed by documentary evidence. She killed him. Izzy's voice came out empty. Hollow. The voice of a woman who had spent 8 years suspecting and hoping she was wrong. She killed him with arsenic over 6 months. Forged a will. Sold his things piece by piece. And I've been working in her basement cataloging the evidence of her theft for 3 years while she threw parties celebrating profits from his murder. Long silence, the kind that holds things too large for words. Then Izzy looked up. Her eyes were dry, but something in them had changed, something that had been sleeping for 8 years, fed on injustice and grief, and the daily erosion of being treated as furniture by people who would cease to exist in her world within the week. The auction. It's in 3 days. She's selling the last of his personal effects. Lot 47. If him there if I bid, if I claim ownership publicly shall have to respond. And Arthur Pennington has the real will. I contacted him last month. He's been waiting for the right moment. A pause that felt like a blade being drawn. Him go to walk into that auction hall. Him going to bid on my grandfather's legacy. And when they laugh at me, and they will going to let them, because every person in that room will be a witness. And then Arthur Pennington is going to walk through those doors with the truth. If you're sensing that Izzy has been playing chess while everyone else was checking hers, you're paying attention. Subscribe now and join the 20 who actually saw this coming. The Grand Continental Hotel ballroom was exactly what Izzy had expected: crystal chandeliers throwing fractured light across white linen tables. A podium backed by a banner proclaiming Blackwood, estate the collection of a lifetime in letters large enough to read from the cheap seats, and 500 of the wealthiest collectors, investors, and socialites in the region dressed in clothing that cost more than Izzy's annual rent multiplied by every year since her disinheritance. She had borrowed the dress from a consignment boutique in a neighborhood where Cordelia Cunningham's friends would never be caught dead, a charcoal sheet that fit adequately and looked precisely as expensive as something a cataloguer could afford on her salary. She wore her hair in the tight ponytail, her crooked reading glasses perched on her nose. Her beige cardigan hung open over the dress like armor she didn't know how to remove, and she carried a numbered auction paddle in her right hand like it was a weapon, because it was. The auction proceeded beautifully. Rare books fetched staggering sums. American furniture pieces drew competitive bidding wars. Jewelry sparkled under lights and disappeared into velvet-lined boxes carried by assistants who probably made more in tips than Izzy's monthly paycheck. Cordelia sat in the front row, dressed in the widow's black she had never quite stopped wearing, diamond earrings blazing like small accusations, the Blackwood signet ring on her finger, Izzy's grandfather's ring, worn by his murderer, catching chandelier light with every gesture she made. Sterling sat beside her, his mother's son, her accomplice in everything, practically vibrating with anticipation of the inheritance he believed would eventually be his. Julian stood near the podium, providing authentication consultations, looking exhausted in the way of someone who had been working 16-hour days preparing for this event. He hadn't noticed Izzy enter. Nobody had noticed Izzy enter. She was very good at not being noticed, until Lot 47, the personal effects collection of Reginald Blackwood. The auctioneer's voice warmed with particular reverence reserved for lots that carried emotional weight beyond monetary value, including 17 rare timepieces, personal correspondence, and memorabilia. Well, start the bidding at $50,000. The room stirred. Hands went up. Numbers were called. The price climbed with a particular energy of people who understood they were buying pieces of a dead man's soul and didn't care. And then, from the very back of the room, $500. Dead silence. Every head turned. 500 faces swiveling toward the rear of the ballroom, toward the figure standing alone in the cheap seat, paddle raised, wearing clothes that mark her as someone who had wandered in by mistake, who clearly didn't understand how auctions worked, who was about to be gently but firmly removed by security for interrupting serious commerce with. Laughter. It started as a ripple, a few titters from the tables nearest her. Then it spread like wildfire through the room, until 500 wealthy people were laughing at the girl in the beige cardigan who had just bid pocket change on a lot valued in the millions. The laughter was cruel, universal, the specific cruelty of people who had never been poor mocking someone who clearly was. That's adorable. Sterling's voice cut through, loud and sneering. Is this some kind of joke? Security. Remove her. Cordelia had risen from her seat. Her face had gone through several expressions in rapid succession confusion, then something sharper, something that looked almost like recognition, then rage masking fear. This woman has no connection to this estate whatsoever. She's disrupting a legitimate auction. Remove her immediately. Security approached. 2 large men in suits, the kind who were paid to make problems disappear. Izzy stood her ground as they reached her, paddle still raised, chin lifting in spite of the trembling she couldn't quite suppress. Isabel Blackwood. Her voice carried farther than it should have. Granddaughter of Reginald Blackwood. And I'm claiming my grandfather's property. The laughter that followed was worse. So much worse. Devastating in its universality. The laughter of people who believed, absolutely and completely, that she was either delusional, deranged, or attempting some unfathomable scam. The laughter of people who would never in their lives imagine that the girl in the beige cardigan was telling the exact truth. Julian had half risen from his position near the podium. His face cycled through emotions like a slot machine landing on jackpot confusion, recognition, horror, the dawning understanding that the cataloguer who had known about the watch modification, who had corrected his research errors for 2 years, who had cited papers he recognized now in retrospect as bearing stylistic similarities to work attributed to a mysterious CB. Analyst in specialized journals, that cataloguer was standing at the back of this room, claiming the name Blackwood. Security reached her, took her arm, confiscated her paddle, began escorting her toward the exit, past the laughing tables, past Cordelia's cold, triumphant stare, past Julian's frozen, horrified face, past 500 people who would never forget the moment they laughed at the heir apparent while she was being thrown out of her own family's estate sale. And as they pushed her through the ballroom doors, Izzy managed one final look back over her shoulder. Not broken, not crying. Her expression held something colder than anything in that room, something that had been waiting for exactly this moment. They laughed at her. Every single one of them. Hit the like button if you're feeling the rage and feeling we're going to need it for what comes next. Share this video if you believe that people who destroy others publicly deserve to fall publicly. The service corridor behind the ballroom smelled like industrial cleaner and broken dreams. Izzy made it exactly 37 steps from the exit door before her legs gave out, sliding down a concrete loading dock wall with her shoes scuffing against stone, the remnant of her composure crumbling in the ugly backstage of beautiful events. 60 seconds. She gave herself exactly 60 seconds to break. Her hands covered her face. Her shoulders shook. The sound that escaped wasn't quite a sob, more like the release of 8 years of pressure in a container never designed to hold it. The grief for Reginald, who had believed in her when nobody else did. The rage at Cordelia, who had murdered him and built an empire on his corpse. The exhaustion of pretending to be less than she was, day after day, shift after shift, while the evidence accumulated and the plan took shape, and the moment of revelation drew closer with each fabricated notation in a personnel file she could now use to destroy them all. 60 seconds. Then her hands dropped, her face lifted, and the woman who rose from that loading dock floor was not the same woman who had descended. She reached into a concealed pocket sewn into her cardigan lining. She had come prepared for this possibility, had planned for humiliation as catalyst rather than endpoint, and pulled out her smartphone. Typed 4 words. Phase 2 confirmed. Proceeding. Sent. Then from the alley entrance, footsteps. Deliberate. The tap of a cane on concrete. Arthur Pennington emerged from the shadows. Silver hair. Military straight posture. Leather folder tucked under his arm. The particular gravitas of a man who had chaired Bar Association ethics committees and advised 3 state governors on judicial appointments. He stopped before her. Didn't offer to help her up. Instead, he looked at her with something that looked remarkably like respect. That was either the bravest thing I've witnessed in 40 years of law, he said, or the most foolish. Either way, he held up the folder. It's time. Izzy looked up at him. Tears tracked her face finally aloud for exactly 60 seconds, the only time she had cried in front of another person in 8 years. She wiped them away, stood up, straightened her ruined cardigan. They laughed at me, called me delusional, had me thrown out like garbage. And now they're all still inside. Arthur's voice carried the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting a very long time for this moment, waiting for Lot 47 to resume, with absolutely no idea what's about to walk through those doors. He extended his hand, not to help her up, to seal a partnership that had been forming in encrypted messages and safe deposit boxes for 18 months. Izzy took it, gripped it firmly. Let's go introduce them to the real Isabel Blackwood. Arthur Pennington just showed up with the real will. If you're not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? The best plot twists in this channel happen in the next 10 minutes. Join the 20. The transformation took 7 hours. 7 hours of returning to the apartment she kept in a neighborhood Cordelia Cunningham had never heard of standing before a bathroom mirror in the ruins of her Cataloguer disguise, of making choices about the face she would present to the world when she stopped pretending forever. The closet section she never used. The clothing of the girl she had been before disinheritance, before poverty, before the plan. Designer pieces she had preserved from her old life, because some part of her had always known this day would come. The emerald green silk dressed the exact shade of the Blackwood family crest. The color she had been forbidden from wearing at family events after her mother's death. The color that would announce her identity to anyone who knew what emerald meant to the Blackwoods. Her grandfather's signet ring, threaded on a leather cord around her neck for 8 years, hidden under cardigans and cheap blouses. Against her skin, her anchor. She unthreaded it now, slipped it onto her right-hand finger, where it belonged, where it would stay. Hair styled into a French twist with intentional tendrils framing her face, the elegance of debutante training she had never quite abandoned. Makeup applied with the precision of someone who had learned to use appearance as armor. The features she had been hiding for 8 years, enhanced rather than disguised. The face of someone who had always been beautiful and had chosen to look forgettable. She stood before the full-length mirror, the cheap one with the crack down the middle, and looked at a stranger who had been living inside her skin, waiting for permission to emerge. Same face, same eyes, same features, but the posture was different. The set of the shoulders, the angle of the chin. The woman in the mirror wasn't crouching anymore, wasn't making herself smaller, wasn't apologizing for existing in a world that should have been celebrating her birthright. She was preparing to walk into a room where 500 people had laughed at her existence, surrounded by colleagues who had watched her destruction and done nothing. And she was going to destroy every single one of them with a leather folder, a signet ring, and 8 years of meticulously documented truth. Subscribe now if you want to see what happens when the disowned heir decides to stop hiding. The best revenge is the kind that comes with paperwork and witnesses. The ballroom had resumed. Lot 47 remained suspended pending legal dispute. The auctioneer had announced, to the visible irritation of Cordelia Cunningham, who had been whispering urgently to Sterling and to the House legal counsel. The crowd murmured with particular energy of wealthy people inconvenienced by complications that threatened their acquisitions. The doors opened at precisely 4 p.m. Izzy walked in. The silence that fell was absolute. Not the laughter 3 hours ago, its evil twin. The silence of 500 people simultaneously realizing that the woman entering the room in an emerald silk dress that matched the Blackwood family crest exactly, wearing a signet ring that matched the one on Cordelia's finger, moving with a particular grace of old money upbringing that no amount of money could fake, was the same woman they had laughed out of the room. Cordelia's face performed a symphony. Confusion, who I asked this Eleg. Recognition, the dress. The ring. Oh God, oh God, oh God. Horror, Blackwood? The granddaughter? Alive? Here. Outrage masking terror that was becoming unmaskable Julian had risen from his position and his mouth was open, his face cycled through emotions that would have been fascinating to chart if anyone had been looking at him instead of the vision in Emerald walking toward the podium like she owned it, which she did. And then Arthur Pennington entered behind her, cane tapping, leather folder raised, the gravity of institutional justice made fleshed-out ladies and gentlemen of the bar, his voice filled. The room like a verdict. I am Arthur Pennington, senior partner at Pennington Associates, executor of the estate of Reginald Blackwood by virtue of his last will and testament, the real last will and testament, dated 2 days prior to his death, which I hold here. He raised a folder. This woman, his hand settled on Izzy's shoulder with a weight of legitimacy, is Isabel Blackwood, sole and lawful heir, the granddaughter whose existence was erased from every record, whose inheritance was stolen through forgery, whose grandfather was murdered by the woman currently wearing his signet ring on her finger. The room erupted, not in violence and sound, as shouts, the gasps, the scrape of chairs, Cordelia screaming something unintelligible, Sterling frozen, in a particular posture of someone whose entire future had just evaporated. And through it all, Izzy stood calm at the podium, emerald dress catching chandelier light, signet ring blazing, waiting for the noise to subside so she could begin. When it finally did, when 500 faces turned toward her in various states of shock and horror and terrible understanding, she opened the leather folder and started to speak. The look on Cordelia's face right now, if you could bottle that expression and sell it, you'd retire tomorrow like this video. If you're feeling even a fraction of the satisfaction in feeling describing it, the documents came out one by one, each one a nail in a coffin that had been building for 8 years. First, a reel with that last page displayed on the projection screen the auction house had hurriedly provided I, Reginald Blackwood, being of sound mind, body, and memory. The name Isabel Blackwood printed beneath it in typeface that left no room for argument that his signature genuine, verified by forensic analysis, dated 48 hours before his death when he was supposedly confused and incompetent per Cordelia's claims, the will that named her sole heir to everything to the estate, that the businesses, the art collection, the $400 million, all of it, hers, second to forgery analysis. The current will that Cordelia had presented examined side by side with the real one, the notary stamp that postdated Reginald's death by 3 months, the paper stock that hadn't existed until after the funeral, the Cordelia's fingerprints on the critical pages she had forged herself, in her own handwriting, with her own fingerprints. Like the arrogant amateur murderer, she apparently was the third, the financial timeline to asset sales beginning 6 weeks after the funeral. Not 6 months of grieving, 6 weeks of liquidation. The particular frenzy of someone who knew the stolen goods might be reclaimed and want to convert them to cash before anyone could question her title to. And fourth, at the document that broke Cordelia completely to the toxicology report that arsenic, slow accumulation that administered through vitamin supplements that only Cordelia handled, that only Cordelia ordered, that only Cordelia had access to the 6-month window matching exactly the timeline of Reginald's decline, the method, the opportunity, the motive, the murder of Reginald Blackwood, proven in black and white, displayed on a projection screen in front of 500 witnesses, including 3 off-duty police officers who had been attending the auction as private citizens and were now very officially on duty. Izzy set the toxicology report in the center of the display table, looked at Cordelia, who had gone pale as parchment, whose diamond earrings were now trembling along with the rest of her, whose mouth was working without producing sound. "You didn't just steal my inheritance, Cordelia." That Izzy's voice cracked slightly, the only break in her composure. The grief of 8 years leaking through it. "You killed the only person who ever loved me unconditionally. You poisoned him over 6 months while he trusted you. You forged his will. You sold his memory piece by piece to fund a lifestyle you never deserved. And you've been living in M.Y. house, wearing M.Y. family's ring, spending M.Y. money, while I worked in your basement, cataloging the evidence of every crime you committed." She turned to address the room. 500 faces, 500 witnesses. 500 people had laughed at her 3 hours ago and were now silent as graves. "These items, lot 47, belong to me. They always did. This estate belongs to me. It always did. And the woman who stole it from my family," she pointed at Cordelia, now surrounded by the officers who had entered during the presentation, "is going to spend whatever years the law allows answering for what she did to my grandfather. This auction is adjourned. This estate is closed out, and I am home." She set the gavel down, walked toward Julian, who hadn't moved from his position, whose face held something that looked like worship and terror and hope all tangled together. "You asked how I knew about the watch modification." She stopped in front of the, close enough to touch the answer. "Is it was mine. He gave it to me on my 8th birthday. I gave it back when he died. And today I'm taking it home along with everything else she stole." She extended her hand, not forgiveness, not yet, just the acknowledgement that he had failed to see her, that she was giving him the chance to earn the right to stand in her grandfather's library with her someday, that she was possibly maybe willing to find out whether the man who had cited her research without knowing her name could become someone worthy of the Blackwood name. His fingers wrapped around hers, a warm, slightly trembling, the most important handhold of his entire life. That moment, her hand in his, the room silenced, the villain in custody if your heart isn't pounding. Check your pulse and share this video with anyone who believes that justice, no matter how delayed, is the most beautiful sight in the world. The Blackwood Estate Library was exactly as she remembered it. Tall windows overlooking grounds she had played on as a child, Leather furniture her grandfather had selected for comfort rather than display, bookshelves reaching toward ceilings decorated with crown molding she could trace with her eyes in the dark. The pocket watch collection, Lot 47. Recovered, restored, home arranged on the desk where it belonged. Each piece gleaming in the evening light. Like reclaimed stars, Izzy stood before the shelf that held her favorite volume from childhood, a first edition of Dickens that her grandfather had read aloud to her during rainstorms, the one she had been forbidden to touch after her disinheritance, the one she ran her fingers across now with the reverence of a pilgrim reaching a shrine. The door opened. Behind her, she didn't turn immediately, knew who it was from the cadence of footsteps, the particular rhythm of someone who spent 14 hours a day on his feet, and moved like he expected space to accommodate him. Not, "You came?" She didn't turn around, kept her fingers on the book's spine. The watch. Julian's voice came out rough, different from professional polish of the auction house that stripped to something more honest. The modification. "You said your grandfather had it. Customized. You didn't say you grew up here, that you knew him, that you are a Blackwood." Izzy studied him for a long moment, this man who had worked beside her for 2 years, who had cited her research 3 times without knowing it was hers, who had looked through her at the preview, without seeing the heir apparent standing in front of him. "You didn't ask," that her voice was gentler than he expected. "Nobody asks catalogers anything, except where's a clipboard. I want to tell you that dozens of times, but I couldn't risk exposure, not until everything was ready to silence. That wind moved the heavy curtains, the estate settling around them like a living thing welcoming its mistress home. That I cited your research. Julian's voice cracked slightly. Your protocols point 3 papers in my own name that use methodologies I now know you developed. I took credit for your innovations and congratulated myself on my scholarship. God, Izzy, I took credit for your grandfather's legacy while you were fetching my coffee. That I know the pause, the ghost of a smile, the first genuine one that I read. Everyone, you got them mostly right." He moved close enough that she could see the exhaustion under his eyes, the guilt eating at him, the hope that maybe possibly she might allow him to try to earn forgiveness. He hadn't known he needed to earn. What happens now? His voice was rough. To us, to gesture at library, estate, everything visible through the windows. After all of this, I don't know. Izzy's honesty was disarming. That I've been planning the vengeance part for 8 years. I didn't plan for what comes after. I suppose that depends on whether you can see me as something other than the girl who fetched your clipboards. I see you as a woman who just owned a room of 500 people with a leather folder and a signet ring. That his voice dropped, became something raw. I see you as the person I should have seen 2 years ago, and am hoping. He reached for her hand. You'll let me earn the chance to be someone worthy of standing in this library with you, to have earned the right to help you rebuild what she tried to destroy. Izzy looked at his hand, at his face, at the damage and the hope and the desperate sincerity of a man who had failed her in the ways that mattered and was begging for the chance to fail better next time. She took his hand. Not forgiveness, not yet, just the acknowledgement that he might be capable of becoming someone she could forgive someday. Possibly the evening light through the tall windows caught the emerald of her dress, the gold of his cufflink, the warmth of their joined hands outside. The estate ground stretched toward the horizon. She now owned every acre, every tree, every memory embedded in soil that was finally hers again. That moment in the library, is it romantic redemption or too little too late? I have my opinion. That best response gets pinned. The debate starts now. That morning light flooded to the front entrance of Blackwood Estate for the first time in 8 years, with Blackwood standing in the doorway. Who belonged there? Izzy walked through the entrance, hauled the doors that had been locked against her, the home she had grown and that had been stolen, now restored, and hers passing the spaces where Cordelia's horrible modern renovations were already being torn out, where Reginald's taste was returned like a body, rejecting a transplant. She paused at the portrait gallery, that empty frames, where Blackwood ancestors looked down. One of them would hold her portrait soon. She continued to the library, set down one item on her grandfather's desk, the framed photograph of herself at 8 years old, beaming up at Reginald, the one she had kept in every crappy apartment for 8 years, the one that was coming home. She sat in his leather chair, not Cordelia's modern monstrosity, grandfather's original chair, the one that fit her like it had been waiting, that looked out at the estate grounds spreading below in morning light. Breathed. Her phone buzzed. Dinner in cooking. Don't worry, I took lessons. Also, I brought a first aid kit to Julian. Izzy smiled, genuinely, warmly, the first sustained real smile of the entire story. Typed back the library, 7 o'clock. Don't burn my grandfather's house down. Set the phone down and looked at Reginald's portrait. Looked at the view the estate spread beneath her in morning light. Every tree and terrace and building in memory. Hers again, recovered, restored, reclaimed. She was home, not as the cataloguer. They forgot, as the Blackwood heir. They would never forget if you made it this far, if you stayed for the auction humiliation, cheered the will revelation, hoped for the library romance, and believed in the disowned heir who turned out to own everything they came to buy. You're exactly who this channel exists for. To subscribe now to join the community of invisible people who refuse to stay unseen. And I'll see you in the next story about someone else who was underestimated, who endured, and who won. Until then, may everyone who ever laughed at your truth live to read your name on the document that proves you were right all along.